Okay, designers, in this particular video, we are going to be talking about how to lay out a marker. Before we begin, we're going to first talk about some vocabulary. The first term you need to know is what's known as the yield. The yield is the amount of fabric that it's going to take in order to cut this particular item, whether that be a jacket or a skirt or a pair of pants. What is the minimum amount of fabric we need in order to cut? In many cases, the manufacturer has a good sense of how much fabric a particular garment takes. So for example, a normal jacket on a 44-45 piece of goods, that's the width, 44-45, will take 3 yards. On a 60-inch piece of goods, that same jacket will take less yardage. It will be about 2 3/8 yards. So therefore, if you do not have a marker or you do not know the exact fabric measurements, you can guesstimate that a basic blazer will take you 3 yards on 44-inch goods and 2 3/8 yards on a 60-inch piece of goods. This is what's known as the cuttable width. Normally when you buy a piece of fabric, there are 2 measurements that are written on the end of the bolt. You may see a number like 44-45, or you might see 58-60. What that simply means is that the fabric itself is 45 inches in width, but the cuttable width is only 44 inches because you have to account for the selvage. Many times a designer will undercalculate their fabric because they're looking at the 45 width and thinking, at 45 inches, I have all of this fabric that I can cut this jacket. But the reality is, depending on the width of the selvage might be a 1/2 inch selvage, might be a 1 inch selvage, you will have less fabric than you actually think you have. Conversely, on a 60-inch piece of goods, you will see 58-60. That means the goods are 60 inches in width, but the cuttable measurement is only 58 inches. Our next term is called the marker. The marker is when the marker maker, and that's their title, marker maker, lays out the fabric to determine what is the minimum amount of fabric that is needed in order to cut this particular item. The way a marker maker works is that he will lay out all of the pieces, the fronts, the backs, the side panel sleeves, and then he will take his ruler and he will measure off how much fabric that is. So he'll take a yardstick and he will then measure off how much yardage. But when he is done, he will take the marker up and then he will lay it down again. What he's trying to do is to beat the last measurement. And the marker maker may even do this 3 times, laying out the marker, checking the measurement, laying out a second time to see if he can get that measurement even shorter. And then he might even do it a 3rd time to see if he can get that even shorter. The reason he's doing this is that fabric is the most expensive cost in a garment. As soon as you buy the fabric, 45% of the cost has already been taken up before you even put a needle to the garment. So your marker has to be really, really tight. The next thing we're going to talk about is the fabric itself. Now, there's 2 different types of fabrics. We have fabrics that have a nap to them, and you've worked with fabrics like that. Corduroys are fabrics with naps to them. And then we have plain weave or unnapped fabrics. So I have a piece of napped fabric here. And you can see the one thing that you want to do before you start cutting the fabric is that you want to check to see if the fabric actually has a nap. And you do that by simply rubbing your hands in one direction, and then you'll rub it in the other direction. If you see that there's shading when you go back in the opposite direction, and I'm not certain that you can actually see this inside of the video, I'll do a bigger swatch. If you see shading in the fabric, that simply means it has a nap and it can only be cut in one direction. So you would smooth your hand, you would find out which way the nap wants to lay, and that's the direction in which you will cut your garment. I have another napped fabric here, and this particular napped fabric, it might be a little more difficult to see that it has a nap, so you have to check very carefully. When I open this fabric up, and this is something similar to an ultra suede fabric, when you rub your hand in one direction, it's smooth, but when you rub it back in the opposite direction, it might be a little tricky seeing the nap, but there's definitely a nap going on in this fabric. So do check your fabrics carefully to make certain that they have that they don't have a nap, or whether they do have a nap. The next fabric I'm going to talk about is a plaid or a stripe or a check fabric. Now here I have a fabric. This is a fabric which has a stripe and it has a check in it. It has what's known as a houndstooth check in it. Now, if you're going to be working with a fabric that has a stripe or a plaid or a check, you cannot exactly cut them the way you cut a plain weave fabric. You're going to have to check that marker carefully. Generally, when we are cutting the fabric, we simply fold it in half and we match up selvage to selvage. And on a plain weave fabric, we would then begin to lay out our marker and cut. But a fabric like this is different, because even though when I lay this up and I'm checking to see that the stripe on the top is lined up with the stripe on the bottom, pulling it selvage to selvage only guarantees that this stripe is lining up. But it does not guarantee that this stripe going this way is lining up. So you begin to realize that you have to line up the stripe going vertically, and then you have to check to make certain that the stripe is matching up horizontally. So it has to match in both directions, this way, and it has to line up this way. You'll generally only find this type of thing in a very high-end garment. On low-end garments, they really don't care whether the stripes match up. They don't care whether the seams miter or anything of that nature. Also, you have to understand that the yield on a stripe or plaid or check, if you're making it as a high-end garment, is actually going to be much higher than on a plain weave fabric. In a plain weave fabric, I can lay the marker in tight, but if I'm doing a high-end jacket, which happens to be a stripe or a plaid or a check, the marker is going to be looser because I'm trying to lay out and match up all the pieces. So how do they match up all these pieces? I'm going to get a pattern piece here, and this is going to be my sleeve. On a pattern, you will find many lines on that pattern, but only one of those lines will have an arrow at both ends. This is the grain line. Any other line on the pattern is known as a stripe line, and that line was put there such that the cutter could lay out the pattern and make certain that a particular stripe is landing exactly on this line. So if I was creating this jacket, I would want to have a line in the exact same place. I'll put it here. And then I would ensure that all of the stripes match up perfectly, because I'm using this line on my pattern as a guide to follow this stripe on my fabric. Sometimes they will actually even cut out a swatch of the fabric and lay it on that stripe line, because it's not that they just want the stripe to match up, but they want a particular pattern piece to land perfectly in a certain spot. And this will be done for the pocket, so the piping stripings will match the jacket. The flaps on the piping will match the piping and the jacket. The sleeves will match the body, such that this stripe coming around the sleeve will land perfectly in the same spot on the body of the jacket. that is a very high-end garment in which all of the stripes are going to be lined up perfectly. Now I'm going to show you two ways in which you can lay out your marker. First thing to know is that you're going to need a yardstick. You are going to need an 18x2 ruler, and you are going to need your chalk. The first way in which you can lay out a marker is you don't have the fabric. So you're assuming that you're going to use a 44-45 piece of goods, meaning the fabric is 45 inches, but it's 45 cuttable. What I could do is I could take my yardstick and I can, using my table, mark off 22 inches. Because remember, if it's 44 inches and I fold it in half, that means it's going to be 22 inches on the fold. So I can measure in 22 inches on a table, and then I can take my ruler and I can turn it horizontally. And this space in here represents my fabric. I can then begin to lay out my pattern pieces accordingly, and then I can calculate how much fabric I need. So once again, you don't actually have to have the actual fabric to lay out the marker. You should know whether you're working with a 44-45 piece of goods or whether you're working with a 60-inch 58 cuttable piece of goods. Now I'm going to show you how to lay out the marker using the actual fabric. So here I have a fabric, and this fabric happens to be a twill fabric. So I'm going to lay this out. And what I'm going to do is, when we smooth out the fabric, we don't smooth it out with our hands. That's what the 18x2 ruler is for. So I use the 18x2 ruler to help me to line up my fabrics and make certain that everything is lined up perfectly. This makes it easier to smooth out the fabric and get it lined up properly. Let's pull this up a little bit so that we can lay out for this marker. Now, on this particular fabric, this happens to be a two-way fabric. And what that simply means is I can lock my pattern pieces in. In other words, instead of all of my pattern pieces having to go in one direction, like with a napped fabric, I actually could turn pieces in this direction and in this direction. If it will help me to get a tighter marker, I can conceivably do that. That's because when I look at these goods, whether I'm going in this direction or whether I'm going in this direction, the twill is going to look exactly the same way. So if you're working with a solid fabric, it's most likely going to be a two-way fabric, and twill fabrics are also going to be two-way fabrics. So now the pattern maker, the marker maker starts to lay out his marker pieces. And I'm going to start by laying out my back piece. Let's put the back here. I'm going to lay out my side pattern piece. And notice how tight I'm laying my marker. The pieces are literally touching one another. Now this particular pattern happens to be a cardigan jacket. So it does not have a lapel. But if it did have a lapel, I would have to take that into account. So I lay out three pieces like so. I'm then going to lay out for my sleeve. And we shall, let me get some of this stuff out of my way. I'm going to lay out my sleeve pieces. Let's see, let's lay out undersleeve right here. And then I'll lay out my top sleeve. I'm going to lay out my facing. And hopefully all of this is inside of the camera. And now I have my collar and my facing pieces here. Notice that the grains are in different directions. I told you anytime a piece is rectangular in nature, meaning it's longer than it is wider, it is stood up in the marker. It is cut going in this direction. So the top collar is cut going up and down the goods. The under collar is cut across the goods. That's because we have more stretch in the cross grain than we have in the straight grain. Now, when I go to lay this here, it's not a good marker because I'm going over into my selvage. But because this is a two-way fabric, I'm going to turn my facing over this way. So the pattern pieces don't all have to lay face up. They can be laying face up, they can lay laying face down, they can be going up, they can be going down. Anything that will allow you to get a tight marker. Do remember that this can only be done on a one-way fabric. So I look here and I say, my collar can fit right into this piece right here. And because center back does not have a seam, you notice that on the under collar, it has half inch seam allowance, but on the top collar, it's really being cut on the fold. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it like this, and then I'm going to just flip it over to check to see if I can get the entire collar in there. And I see, yes, I can actually cut my entire collar piece right here. And because this is doubled fabric, there's a piece up underneath. So I actually can get my facing on the other piece. So literally, both pieces can go right in here. I only have one facing, it says cut one, and I only have one top collar, which fits into here. So both of these pieces will be cut in this section, and then finally, I will take my under collar and I will lay it in over here. And so this is my marker. It's nice and tight. The next step is that you would have to check to make certain that your grain line is parallel to your selvage all the way or to the edge of your fabric. Each one of these I would check. Once I have this one set up perfectly, I'm going to check this grain against this grain. And then I will check this grain against this grain, making certain that everything is perfectly squared up. I check to make certain that this is absolutely parallel to the edge of the fabric. And then once again, I check this grain against this grain, and then I'll check this grain against this grain. If all that is true, I'm going to lock it down. Now, in the industry, we really don't use pins. We really do use a lot of weights. So you will be seeing me dropping weights on different pieces. I'm not going to cut this out, but just to give you a demonstration. And this is how I would lay out my marker. Last thing I want to say to you is, do be mindful that all fabrics are not the same. Just because something is 100% wool doesn't mean that it's the same as another 100% wool. There are different qualities of wool. You can have a $5 a yard piece of wool, and you can have a $500 yard piece of wool. They're both 100% wool, but the quality of each one is different. So make certain when you are buying your fabrics, feel the hand of the fabric, feel the softness of the fabric. See if it feels like a quality good, even if it isn't a quality piece of goods. What you don't want to buy is an inexpensive piece of fabric and it turns out to be a piece of crap, for lack of a better word, and then you're stuck with this bad fabric. Eventually it will start to pill up on you, it will start to crack, it will do all of the things that a cheap fabric does. Okay, so there you have it. There's your demonstration on how to lay out a marker on different types of fabrications. By the way, the reason for the chalk is such that I can mark the wrong sides of each of the pieces, and I can also mark the grain direction. If I'm dealing with a one-way fabric, then I always want to show them which direction the fabric is going in. This is merely to tell them that this is the wrong side of the goods. Good luck to all of you.